but there will always be two or three issues that will be hotly contested because it really means the freedom of expression and the idea of safety and privacy and what that means to the state versus what that means to the citizen.
Hi, I'm Jhalak.
This is Sachin.
And welcome to the CCG Tech Podcast.
Mahima, welcome to the CCG podcast. It's so amazing to have you join us. You've had such an interesting journey in the technology, law and policy space. Worked with some very interesting organizations, done a lot of deep work around trust and safety on social media platforms, other kinds of internet platforms. And we're really excited to learn from your perspectives today. Could you give our listeners a bit of a brief about what brought you into this space and the kind of experiences you've had?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Jhalak and Sachin, for having me on the podcast today. I'm really excited to be here because I feel that, the last 10 years of my life have been spent leading public policy for big tech. So I spent 6 years. I was the first public policy employee for Twitter in India, and I led, the work around South Asia. I built up not just like the public policy, but the government partnerships vertical, the philanthropy vertical that we call Twitter for Good, and it was quite a diverse and very rich profile, and then I moved on and I went to Bumble, where I set up their public policy work across APAC. So India was one of the countries, but I also focused on Singapore and Australia. So that was really interesting, and I can't wait to share stories about that. But my interest in tech and society came before I joined tech companies. I actually worked as a journalist. I used to cover stories around tech and society, in part because I was always the youngest and they used to give me the tech stories, but I liked it. And I also worked in the development sector where I used to work with projects like video volunteers that help people, in those days, the cameras weren't as fancy, but, help people tell their own stories. And so thereby, I think it was like almost the precursor to that user generated content that I became so familiar with. So I worked in this sector as a journalist, as a development practitioner, and ultimately as a tech executive. And at the moment, I'm sitting back and making sense of it all.
And I'm so glad we've caught you at this moment in time when you're really reflecting on this tremendous journey you've had and the great work you've done around trust and safety, public policy related to internet platforms. And, I think, over the last few years, increasingly, there's been a lot of spotlight on trust and safety teams at, social media and other internet platforms for a wide variety of reasons. Social media platforms are increasingly under scrutiny. They're being relied on for many activities by users. Governments are increasingly becoming very cognizant and sensitive about harms that users seem to be facing online. Could you break down for our listeners what role do these trust and safety teams play within these mammoth social media platforms? And have you've been in this space now for a long time, how have you seen the functions of these teams evolve and maybe differentiate from functions of similarly placed teams within any particular, using the example of any fictional, I guess, social media platform?
Sure. So let me tell you a story, okay? When I joined Twitter, it was very clear that there was a lot of abuse and harassment on the platform, right? The first thing that happened to me everyone used to tag me. I used to wake up with like hundreds of notifications about different things that had taken place. So I found it very interesting that there seemed to be not enough content moderation going on, right? So what I did was I didn't have a lot of data, but I just had a lot of tags and knowledge of what was happening on the platform. So I made this deck, which is sort of this anecdotal, capturing hate speech, capturing gender-based violence, capturing, spam. You remember copy paste trends, those kind of things that used to take place. And I went to the States for a trip. And I went to San Francisco and I just booked meetings with everybody, a lot of people in the trust and safety teams. And I started giving them this road show, where I was like, listen, India has so many problems. We need more trust and safety focus in India. And what a lot of people told me really surprised me. They said, we didn't realize there were so many problems in India because we barely receive any reports. So we just thought that maybe it's not a very problematic country, which was shocking, right? If you and I listen to this. So I realized that people in India were not aware of the reporting function. And that actually became a big core of my public policy work for the first 2, 3 years, where we actually ran these big campaigns to explain to people that if you've had harm on the platform, you need to report it, because every time you report in harm, you actually let us know what is going on. Internally, we are able to figure out how many people are blocking, how many people are reporting, how many people are unfollowing, and we get a sense of the health of the platform. So I tell you that story as a way to say that, the public policy team that I was on, my ex-boss used to call us the ambassadors or the diplomats. We went outside and we spoke to people. But it was really important because the trust and safety teams that really make sure that the platform is healthy, they are an internal team, or they were for a very long time, very internal facing. So we would flag, different kinds of abuse trends to them. We would tell them what the nonprofits were telling us. We would tell them regulatory trends coming down the line. We would tell them, we would do like risk analysis, or we would participate in risk analysis and let them know how a particular product might function in a different geography. But the trust and safety team has a very, very big job. So the big change that I can tell you is the trust and safety, when I started working at tech companies, was a very reactive function, right? You made a report and they took it down, or they had a look and maybe they kept it up. Over the years, it has become a very proactive function, which is to say that they are trying to remove harm off the platforms before the harm takes place. And just by illustration, the trust and safety team normally consists of number of sub teams. I mean, there are many, but I'll give you the top functions. One is they write the content policy, right? That makes up the community guidelines that you and I have to live by in different platforms. They also train trust and content moderators. So there's a lot of ops going on under them. So people mistakenly used to think public policy did content moderation decisions because they were used to seeing our faces, but actually it happened through the trust and safety teams. They do investigations, right, of like incidents that take place. They do the data analytics and, increasingly put together the transparency reports. And they also have a lot of specialized functions looking into spam, fraud, the bots that you see on the platform. So it is actually a very interesting function that put together sort of takes care of risk, takes care of the running health of the platform, compliance, and emerging threats. So yeah, it's a very complex function that I've had the privilege of working with extremely closely over the last decade.
That's really, excuse me, really interesting, Mahima. Just to follow up, just wondering, speaking, say, on behalf of a lay viewer who, is a casual user of, say, an online platform, what would you say to the, commonly expressed view in drawing room conversations and even in public debates, which is that, oh, I use this platform, but when I have a problem, when there's content I complain about, I hit the relevant buttons, but I never hear back, or there's a sense of opacity. What can you say to such a person about the value that you just spoke about now, that trust and safety teams are adding, but which may not be so evident to the layperson? How can that become more evident for them, the value that you bring, that these teams bring?
Yeah. Even that work of like reporting and like getting something back or not getting something back has been through a long journey. So I would say to people who tried to do a report like 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 7 years ago, and never really got something back and just felt despondent, just felt like I'm making the effort of doing a report and I hear nothing back. Many of them never even bothered reporting for a couple of years after that, or they just got off the platform, or they started using tools like block and mute and never tested that function again. The truth is that it was pretty opaque, right? Like you had these buttons that were not like adequately manned, let's put it that way, right? Or you had policies, but then who is going to read all the policies and know exactly which one to pick when you're creating a report? Now, what the work that has happened over the last so many years is the guidelines and the community guidelines across platforms have become more granular, and they try and give you more examples of what actually comes under it and what doesn't. So that's the attempt. B is that reporting flows, they've tried to work on it to become easier. I'll give you another anecdote. Like when I used to, many years ago, we were having this conversation with our internal teams about what the reporting flow should look like. And so they said if it's a one-page reporting flow, the user ends up saying, they don't even want to hear from me. I mean, it's just one button and it's over. Like it's not satisfying enough, right? If you have 4 or 5 pages to get through, it's like, well, they actually don't care because they want me to, how much time should I spend on the report? So at that time, maybe a 3 button press, this is what's happened to me, this is the account, and maybe I can add more context was like good enough for someone to actually close that process of reporting because a lot of people could leave it midway. The other thing was that it just went into a black box, right? I remember the early days of Twitter, we would send a report to the email. Now, come on, if you signed up through Hotmail and now you moved to Gmail, there's no way you would be checking it, right? So then it basically started giving you the update on the platform itself, right? So you would get a pop-up saying that, hey, we've received your report. We'll let you know what happens. There's one big gap, which is that because of privacy reasons, a lot of times, platforms don't let users know what has happened to the person that they reported on. And a lot of times it's also done to protect the person reporting. Because if someone's been harassing you and you report them and we take them off the or they take them off the platform, that person figures it out and they might try. So we don't want to tell, I keep saying I'm sorry, but like they don't want to tell them, who reported them. So there are many considerations. Now, the other side of this is that I think the transparency reporting that is now developing across regions and becoming a regulatory compliance issue also helps companies then figure out how they can actually represent. Because I'll give you another anecdote. Now, if 100 people report Sachin and we take down Sachin's account because it's violating, not because might makes right, but because actually you're in the wrong. What should I say in my report? I received 100 complaints and I took action of 1. So then you'll say, my God, reporting doesn't work on this platform. So many people report and they just, but then should I ratio it out and say 1 report, 1 takedown? So it is complicated to be able to present that data. And so that's also a lot of thought that platforms have around that. But I would say to the question, Sachin, is that you should tell people, try and report now. You'll see that it's different. And secondly, and very importantly, you may not actually need to report a lot of things because they are taken off for you. Unfortunately, the value of that is not felt because if you haven't seen the harm, why will you appreciate that it's not there? But the truth is that work is being done in the background.
Mahima, picking up on some of the things that you've been talking about, uh, content moderation and trust and safety teams and platforms, one of the biggest sort of concerns that I've heard repeatedly raised by civil society and academics is that there's not a proportionate allocation of resources towards content moderation, trust and safety teams in proportion to the users in a particular jurisdiction or market. For instance, India may have a lot more users, but the American markets command a lot more resource allocation towards content moderation, trust, and safety activities. What do you think is driving this, and what impact do you think these kind of decisions has around harms and other kinds of issues that users are facing on platforms?
Jhalak, I'll agree with you on that. Like that question is very valid because the truth is that content moderation in countries and regions that get further and further away from Silicon Valley, they take up a lot of space with leadership because they know this is a growing problem. But you're right, they invest first in the US, they invest first in Europe, and then they start looking at APAC. It's obviously easier for a lot of companies to deal with the English language audience first, right? Because they are able to, language is easier. They have a lot of other languages that like cut across different countries. It could be Spanish. There are obviously parts of Europe where the laws to take down illegal content is very strict and was passed before, any of ours were. So there's a lot of resourcing being put over there. In my tenure, what I realized was that, there was a certain innocence almost, which I don't think can be justified today. Maybe you could say 10 years ago, the kinds of uses of social media when the different languages came on. In India, when I saw, the moment like it became, Hindi became a more dominant language, when we would do our annual review, the top retweets, the top tweets, went from English to Hindi. It went from two political parties being the only ones kind of playing on Twitter to everybody having accounts. And elections actually last year, the last elections in 19, were very heavy on Twitter. For example, the complexity of the conversation around class, around caste, around gender misogyny, it just went up. And I agree the teams were not able to effectively handle it. I think from my perspective, what I tried to do when I was at the company was I really tried to raise that awareness within the company that this is a very, very serious issue that you need to pay attention to. Part of it was really to build up the civil society partners that I worked with, right? So, like to make sure that their voices were being heard when they raised issues around what they were seeing in terms of harms in the platform. If I had executives come down to India, including Jack Dorsey came down, his schedule was not about meeting necessarily brand folks and CEOs, but it was being on platforms with all our civil society partners, with the non-profits, seeing really, what the causes are so that leadership could go back and make these investments. What really happened was that the user base around the world started saying, we're not enjoying this anymore, right? Like we don't enjoy being on this platform because there's so much trolling and harm that is taking place. And so it really takes leadership to say, I'm going to invest in safety for it to actually start giving those dividends down the line. You need to increase your trust and safety staffing in Asia Pacific, right? If we're talking about this area, you need to increase the number of people, experts you have in India. You need to be able to fund and in a way upskill academics to be able to give the type of reports that I see when I travel to other regions, because they are getting that type of funding. I don't think the funding is enough over here. We didn't have any universities who could take the fire hose, for example, and do some kind of data analysis, which was happening at US universities because they had that kind of infrastructure in place. So there were a lot of reasons why civil society was also not able to, at that time, adequately raise, the kind of fuss that they are able to raise in the US and then subsequently in Europe. So I think both sides can be better. What I'm very disillusioned by is that since Twitter laid off so much of its workforce, so many other countries have followed suit and laid off, unfortunately, trust and safety personnel. So whatever progress had been made, right, there have been slips behind. And so that's also not nice to see, because the story that you're telling was actually on, like, it was improving. Objectively, it was improving. And now it's kind of, it's a downward slide, I would say.
Thanks, Mahima. Actually, just to build on that, again, would love to get your thoughts on, clearly trust and safety teams are extremely important and they do add value. And as you're just saying, some of that value is becoming evident now, if it wasn't so earlier. But then following up on your point about layoffs, there's another possible concern that I'd love to get your thoughts on, which is, the government in India, for example, coming in and saying that you platforms may do content moderation in XYZ ways, and you may feel that you're bringing some benefit to the table. But here are these, the government is saying additional obligations, rules, laws that they're proposing, which kind of tie your platforms' hands a little bit and maybe compel them to operate in ways that they wouldn't voluntarily choose to. Any thoughts on, is this possibly a good thing, given that trust and safety teams are scaling back? Is it good that the government is getting more involved? Is this going to make platforms responsible and accountable, given that there's a dearth of trust and safety teams and players? Or is there something else that we're not appreciating about the government getting involved in this way?
So I have like multiple thoughts and maybe not even all strung together, with a perfect bow. But on some level, I think the governments had to get involved, right? Like, I think at the time when users were talking about the kind of harms that they were experiencing, the truth is that there just wasn't enough happening on the ground for any government to say, well, you've written to a platform or you've reported a tweet and nothing is happening, and that's okay. There's no one to reach out to. I remember here in India, like when Menaka Gandhi was Minister of the Women, I remember being in the ministry and she said, I'm going to start an email and anyone can email me. So it has been around for a very long time. And so I think that all governments have, in some way or form now, India may have done it a long time ago, but, all governments are asking platforms, listen, We need someone to be able to contact. Users need someone to be able to contact. There needs to be some kind of closure to these reports. You need to have certain timelines. Right now, do you want to put criminal penalties, or how do you want to actually structure that is a different question. But I think most of them are saying that, listen, this being able to respond to law enforcement and being able to respond to users is not left to your own devices. We have to actually regularize this in some manner. So I feel like that was probably inevitable because it was very sparsely kind of staffed at that time when these conversations started. What happens is that when government starts giving you, when they start giving you sort of minimum standards for safety, right? Like this is the minimum you need to do. What will happen is the bulk of platforms will do the minimum, right? Because that's all you need to do to basically be okay in law. So it can be good, it can be bad, right? Some platforms really innovate, they stay ahead of emerging trends. They are the ones. I mean, the reason you know about so many different things is because the platforms actually, do end up giving reports in the end. Sometimes they kind of called, sometimes journalists reveal some investigations, some more responsible platforms actually give out data and tell you what's going on, even though users may not have been aware of it. So I think like there needs to be a way to like incentivize that innovation in safety, right? And not make it lazy that like, oh, I've done the minimum standard. The other is, I think, and I'm going to piggyback on what some academics talk about, because this is not an original thought, but really to separate the content moderation piece from like the minimum standards of safety and, company, the corporate structure, et cetera, that need to exist to operate in the country. And I think those need to be separated out because content moderation will always be slightly contentious, right? Like political speech, if it's a platform that hosts political speech, there'll always be a difference of opinion, free expression. So I think that needs to be separated out. Then the responsibility of the company structure to just be a responsible entity operating in a geography. I'm seeing that in other places. And especially my APAC role really helped me kind of deep dive into what was happening in Australia, for example. So I saw, okay, everybody kind of wants in the end to be in the same place, but we need to do it in the way that companies can grow. You don't have that scare to be in a certain country because you're worried about employee safety or what that actually means. And you can still then spar with a company on content moderation. And that space is still there. And the company can still be structured responsibly. So I do feel like both things are possible. So we need to expand that debate over here in India, which some have
Good
already
to see
started.
that you still have an appetite for sparring with the government on content moderation.
Well, I don't think it'll ever go away. Muscle memory, like
True,
riding a
true.
bike.
Mahima, one of the things that we're hearing from platforms as more regulation is coming in from governments, especially around transparency reporting and putting, these redressal mechanisms in place, and some of the other regulatory interventions that the government is making is that, teams are saying that one of their concerns is that companies will reduce allocations towards content moderation as they have to fulfill these other obligations and functions that are being placed on them. I think a lot of civil society and academics, think about this and they're like, is this something that we should be concerned about? Or is this just some kind of pushback or fear mongering mechanism that platforms are perhaps using to push back on additional obligations being placed on them from the perspective of transparency and grievance redressal?
To that, Jhalak, I would say that it is important for civil society to speak to a range of platforms. I found that the attitudes, of platforms that was started in the age where there was like literally no regulation and compliance and kind of spend the next like 7 to 8 years kind of trying to make up and, like plug holes versus platforms that were started about 10 years later and already knew what the minimum safety expectations were and kind of had that mindset that we have to fulfill them can sometimes be different. So I do believe that like there is a variety of opinion in this case. The other thing you have to remember, the platforms are not all the functionality is not the same. So not every platform, say, has the potential for virality, right? Which is a huge risk when it comes to like misinformation. Not every platform, like I worked for an app that basically did not have a common feed, right? And the only way to really talk to each other was a one-on-one. So there was no real threat. I mean, you can never say zero, but there was no real threat for some like big misinformation rumor to spread. It also wasn't the place where you would disseminate non-consensual, images for, harassment, because you were really sending it on a one-to-one basis. Now, those risks are much more in platforms where the product build allows these things to happen, right? So, so I think they like talk to a range of different platforms, because there are concerns certainly with some platforms that other platforms may not share, and it just depends on where they are in evolution and how they see this idea of safety, and like the fact that now we built a transparency report mechanism for one country. It's a bit of a pain, of course, but can we then just like cookie cutter it, in the next couple of years and make sure that we're collecting that data? A lot of this has to do with how the data is being collected. So say I have to do a transparency report for 5 to 6 different categories. If I'm not actually labeling that when I'm collecting the reports right now, it'll be very difficult for me to then put out that report at the end of the year. But if I change my practices, which yes, I agree is a cost, right? And that is a cost. But if I change those practices over time, it becomes easier for those reports to be published. So I will agree, Jalak, that yes, of course, a lot of the companies will have to invest in places that they have not previously invested in to be able to meet compliance. But if I put my user hat on and I say, would I like to know, if you tell me that you're taking care of harms, would I like to know what's happening? Can civil society get a sense of what harms or what trends are taking place in which platform? It could be more useful for research, right? So it can't be a complete no. Uh, but yes, increasing safety, increase costs, and it cannot all be done in one go. So even regulators need to understand that they have to give time to companies. When they're having a conversation, nothing can be done in 2 months and 3 months. It's not possible. So you need to give them a little more time to be able to comply eventually. And you need to also have a dialogue in terms of what is useful. A lot of times, demands are made of companies that look good. So I heard someone recently use the word regulatory theater. So a lot of things are done because they look and sound good, but the ultimate impact may not be, may not be relevant. But again, the question is, if they look and sound good, then does that also give a little benefit to the user who says, okay, I have a sense of what's happening on this platform. My child is going to start using this platform at the age of 13. They do give some details about what kind of harms exist. So I think like we should really approach these questions from many different perspectives.
No, thanks. Thanks, Emma. Just to kind of follow up on that, you mentioned virality, and I think these days one can't really talk about virality without mentioning TikTok at some point. Would love to know, if you have a take on, what's happening in the US with TikTok, and B, if you have any thoughts in general on, in terms of looking to the future, what are some ways that content moderation, trust and safety can be done out of the box approaches that we haven't considered? For example, some people are saying users should have a say, like a vote up or down in terms of what the community standards should be. If you have any thoughts on that, so A, on TikTok, and B, on what's the future for trust and safety. Thanks.
Yeah, I think with trust and safety and content moderation, like based on the platform, they'll have different content moderation philosophies, right? Like I never really used anything else while I was on Twitter, right? And Twitter was like fairly centralized in the sense that the content moderation will happen internally, but a lot of tools were then given to people to curate their own timeline. Once I got off Twitter, I started spending more time at Reddit, and I sort of really appreciated like each I like the community moderation aspect of it. And so I liked it for that. But I still go back to Twitter for like what Twitter offers, less and less sometimes, but what it offers. And then like Instagram seems more private to me because that's how I use it. So I do believe that content moderation should remain, different compared to where you are. Couple of things that I see coming down the line, one of them is that, of course, a lot of content moderation bits and pieces will be outsourced to vendors and to AI enabled apps and things that can give that scale that is not possible. So hopefully it doesn't become really standardized, because I do enjoy the fact that there are different platforms. So that's one. Two is with TikTok and these apps. the users really seem to enjoy it, and it seems to be like the primary place for information. As a parent, I worry a little bit about short attention spans and all that stuff that you're supposed to worry about. So yeah, of course, tick box, I worry about all of it. But I do believe that there should be enough choice with the users. A lot of research ends up showing that, like, if that Streisand effect, if you try and take down certain content, actually more people end up seeing it. So is that really useful? Are you actually, releasing children from that harm vector that you're talking about? Or do you just let it go in the background? So yeah, I think it'll always be a sort of complicated issue, but I do believe that there should be two, three philosophies of content moderation that should be spread across different platforms, and it shouldn't become like this cookie cutter. We box ourselves into a place where it all just looks the same and all platforms kind of feel the same. I would hate to see that happen in the future.
When you talk about 2 3 different approaches to content moderation, could you sort of give our users a sense of what that could look like? And I guess a related question to that, building on the point you just closed with, is you hope that regulation does not make it a cookie cutter approach. So, do you think regulations like the DSA that are coming out in the EU will start pushing platforms towards a more cookie cutter approach, or do you think that there is enough flexibility in the way these regulations are currently designed to allow for different and varied approaches to content moderation based on different platforms, the needs of users, the structure of platforms, etc.?
Yeah. So first, let me start with that idea of different philosophies, right? I mean, this is not a definitive list, and I'm sure there are many others that exist. But just to my mind, you've got the free speech, right? So the speech is really important. The ability to have that thought, to express that thought, is really important, and the platform will fight to protect that space. Obviously, Twitter being a very obvious example, but I think even other platforms like Reddit and all would say that thought and the ability to talk about different subjects is very important. So there'll be plenty of platforms that like value that, right, above all else, or at least that will be like one of those, untouchable, or sort of in that zone. There will be platforms that take safety first. A lot of this depends on also if you have children on your platform or if you have teens on your platform, where like your approach will be that, we don't need to host every discussion on our platform. We want to just make sure that we have that minimum safety standard because we have kids, and that's going to become an area of pressure increasingly, especially in our part of the world where people are still having children. You've got a young demographic coming in. It may not be the same in some countries where it's not going to be a factor in a couple of years, but you do need to make sure that there's less harms available to children when their minds are still growing and they might be on social media. So those platforms will project themselves as safer alternatives, right? Because they will find value in saying that I'm a safer platform, come to me. There will be the platforms that don't want any of the centralized decision making, and we want to go in a decentralized manner. I haven't really kept up a lot with, like, say, a Blue Sky and other platforms like that, but you will always have that, like, people who want to return to the original promise of the internet, right? And like just the fact that we run our own show, and so that will be there. And then I think there'll be like very compliance heavy kind of platforms also, where they may not be that front end. They might be enterprise, or they might be different in the value chain, and they just run on compliance because they are not looking to really be in the headlines for anything. So, it's just the approach that different platforms will have on this subject. So I think that that's definitely something to track, right? And then the second bit, what you said is, yes, I mean, I also hope it's not cookie cutter. So my experience, say, dealing with the Australian government was that under the Online Safety Act, what they had was that they wanted industry to develop industry specific codes, which were all done through industry groups and the companies. And so within those codes, basically they had different codes for different types of, so enterprises did one, SMS, did one, social media did one, other relevant electronic services, as they call them, did one. So within the codes that applied to me at my last job, there were certain things spelled out for, say, dating apps, right? That they wanted like a certain kind of minimum safety compliance over there. Obviously, the biggest debate was about encrypted apps. A lot of other apps kind of fell into line with, I think, minimum standards, because now everyone actually has raised their minimum standards. So many of them were able to say, all right, we can comply to this, but there will always be two or three issues that will be hotly contested, because it really means the freedom of expression and the idea of safety and privacy and what that means to the state versus what that means to the citizen.
I think that's really useful, Mahima. Especially as India is reimagining and reframing its own sort of legislative framework around regulating internet platform. As many of our listeners would have heard us reference in other episodes of the CCG podcast, India is looking to frame a new Digital India Act, which would come in and replace the Information Technology Act that we've had in place for the last 2+ decades. Mahima, what would be, for someone who has worked at a global scale, but also worked very deeply within the Indian context, right? I don't think, we can blindly transpose what is, say, being done in the EU or in Australia to the Indian context. Laws have to be contextualized. So, given your deep experience in this space, what are some of the things you would like to see in a law like the Digital India Act from a trust and safety content moderation perspective? And what are some of the pitfalls you think we should avoid, or things you think may not work, being transplanted from a Western context into the Indian context?
Yeah, so looking at the Digital India Act, I think that there is a huge area of opportunity right now to really, from the Indian perspective, see how the experience of using many of these platforms and technologies on the ground has been versus what the tech companies or many of us thought the experience would be. And I say this because, there's a little bit of research that's come out from different parts of the country, say, for example, about the experiences of children in slums, and how they have actually used social media to navigate caste and class, and how they use these platforms, and those come up in content moderation decisions, right? You might think someone is impersonating somebody else and not presenting themselves honestly, but the truth is they just want to drop their caste identity for 5 minutes, and just be somebody else on social media, and that's something that's come out. Or if you say real names, for example, on the platform, and girls in India, they don't want to use their full name because they don't want strangers to look them up, right, and find out where they are living. And so there are so many different things that come out when you start getting deeper into how platforms are being used in society, that I do believe this is the opportunity to really, encourage more research on how the platforms and different types, not just social media, but gaming and like dating apps and whatever else you might think of, have actually been used so that we get a clearer picture of what is the Indian need. Otherwise, what happens is, you're right, you copy and paste the top three from, all jurisdictions, because those are not bad things to have in your law. So I think this is a big opportunity. The other is, there can be some standards, obviously, for content moderation that will be spelt out. There are two things that I, out of my experience, worry about. One is this over indulgence, not indulgence, but expectation of like this proactive monitoring, right? Like it's not possible to proactively monitor everything, and it's certainly not possible for a company to determine what's illegal if a court has not determined it to be illegal. And there is a tendency to maybe want to avoid like judicial process and go into executive process. So I think we really need to think about like what that means for us in the future. Like sometimes there's a fight in the moment between, a company and the government, or a user and a company. I remember there was a user who sued Twitter and actually asked Meti to step in, inviting the government into the process. Like in that moment, it may seem okay, but what are you actually doing in the long run, right? Are you really inviting the government in to make a content moderation decision that ideally you would like the company to keep? So I think we need to really evaluate some of those incidents that take place. The third would be that I personally have not liked this reliance on individual as nodal officers and grievance officers. I think the scale is a lot. So there should be people you can contact, of course, but there should be a process. It should be very process oriented, because these are very large markets. And so it needs to be a robust and a responsive system. So those are things that I would, sort of say we must keep in mind. Public-private consultations. Consultations, again, I'll say, to be meaningful, so that you don't just do a consultation and see that your expertise has not been used, right? I think that doesn't inspire confidence. So it should be done in a way that you actually take the experience of so many of us who work in public policy, so many, of my friends who are in these think tanks, in non-profits. I mean, they know a lot. So, and the last piece I'll say is that I feel like there's a huge knowledge transfer happening in the US and maybe even Europe, where like people who've been tech executives for a long time are now coming back into civil society, working with foundations, talking about some of these trust and safety issues. I don't think we have that catchment here in India. You don't have like a huge chunk of tech executives who can enter civil society and go back to tech. I think people just stick in their lane, because the opportunities are also not as many as you can imagine. So I feel that I may be wrong. So I think that some of those places benefit from getting that experience from tech into civil society, maybe even into government back. And that's a very normal process that we don't really have here. So, could a tech executive be part of civil society for a couple of years, help think, and be welcomed back into tech for having that expertise of civil society or government? I don't know, but if that's possible here, we would benefit from that knowledge transfer.
Would you consider dipping into civil society?
Listen, I was always civil society, and then suddenly I became a tech executive. So a decade later, yeah, I mean, I think so. Why not? I mean, in the end, I've always felt closer. I mean, very close to the user, right? Like in the user experience, and I feel like I have personally taken so many calls, of people in distress because they didn't know what else to do, right? People who've called up for their friends, their sisters, their brothers, secretaries for their bosses who are going to fire them if something didn't happen. I mean, the whole spectrum of human emotions, So I feel like I've had that customer service job as well, along with the public policy work. So I really do feel for that perspective. It's not just what the company is able to do, but what users are really feeling in that moment, because it becomes a part of your life. So yeah, we'll see. I never say never to anything, but yeah, it will be interesting to be able to do that.
Mahima, we've been primarily in this conversation, I think, largely focused on public platforms and the sort of trust and safety, content moderation issues that we face on platforms like, say, Twitter, which, where many users are able to interact with each other. There's a news feed where I'm able to see content being posted and interacted and engaged with by other users. But we also have scores of private platforms, and you referenced this earlier in the conversation, which is really one-to-one interaction where perhaps questions of virality and misinformation, as you alluded to, are not the most sort of pertinent questions. But there are other trust and safety questions that come up in the context of private platforms. And as India is framing its Digital India Act, what do you think are some of those issues that we should be keeping in mind, and being cognizant of, to build as best practice, build as norms and principles into the framing of these laws?
Yeah, thanks. So, yes, you're right. I think that the public imagination when talking about safety issues obviously goes to, uh, public platforms because they are the most visible. You have the most amount of data on, what's going on over there. And so it's a very natural thing to, and they also affect such wide ranging, meaningful public conversations that take place, policy changes, things like that. So yeah, it's very normal to obviously focus a lot on that. My experience of then moving to a private, a platform that was more private in nature, I realized a couple of things, and I may just talk about the way I look at it or the way I started looking at it. I think for platforms like Twitter, it was like anyone was the user, right? Any type of person could come and do anything. So, on any given day, you could start your morning seeing politicians, then see advocacy campaigns around World Wildlife Fund, then see somebody just making a joke, then see, so it would change quite widely. What I find with other platforms is that there is a very definite use case, right? Like you are here to do this one thing, right? So the user is very well defined. And in the case of my last platform, Bumble, which is a dating app, it was very clear that we want to protect the experience of women. And when we make it safer for women, we make it safer for everyone because those protections. But we'll think for women first, right? So there were a lot of policies in a public platform, in the private platform, for example, content around cyberbullying, fetishization, things like that, that would have not been taken down in a public platform because they may have managed to scrape through that whole idea of free speech. But in a private platform, you could draw much firmer lines and say, we don't want someone who's here to feel bad about themselves, right? So it's a very different mindset you can have depending on what you say the platform is for. The other thing is that, technology is evolving and tech is also being able to fulfill some of the trust and safety problems that I think just community guidelines and that, that old idea of content moderation, one piece of content comes down, like that was not able to do. And I'll give you a story. So I was at Twitter and there was a journalist who was sent um, uh, pictures on WhatsApp, genitalia on WhatsApp, basically, that she was really shocked about. And so she went to Twitter to post them to raise awareness. Now, obviously, on Twitter, they violated our guidelines because you couldn't post those kind of pictures on Twitter. So as a result, our teams were taking off those posts. Now, she got really upset because she said, well, listen, I have been victimized and I'm trying to ask for help. So you're actually silencing the victim, which objectively, yes, of course, that's what was happening. But it was not happening because she was there to raise awareness. It was happening because the content itself was violating our guidelines, right? So it became really complicated. I remember we really didn't know at that point how to navigate this. And so the suggestion was, why don't you upload a blurry picture and then it doesn't need to be removed. So anyway, cut to many years later, I joined this other app, Bumble. And, this is a huge problem there because it's a dating app and people are sending, I mean, the number one problem that women said was that I get these pictures from men. And so they just developed proprietary technology that blurred these pictures on arrival. So you did not have to even see it. You could just report it straight away, thereby not being, traumatized by it. And if it was consensual, I mean, then you can just click on it and open it. So I do feel that, like, when you have a different mindset as a trust and safety team or you're a different kind of company, you can then innovate ideas that should be then opened up to the rest of industry. So what Bumble ended up doing was they open sourced it and they said, if anybody else wants to use this, if you have any kind of, community chat or private chats or whatever, you can just plug this in and you can use this for yourself. So I think partly, this idea when you're talking about safety, like safety by design, which is something, this is a big conversation taking place globally, started a lot by the E-Safety Commission in Australia, is how do you incentivize companies to put safety at the heart of their business model, thereby promising users that, you come here and it's a safe experience and a more enjoyable experience. But equally, how do you upskill everybody in the company to think, about product design and risk in a way that you incentivize safety? So what they had done, and I think can be done in India for, our purposes in our own way, is they had actually come up with three, I think, different frameworks or, to apply for whether you're a big company, large company, mid-sized company, or a startup, to kind of take a test to see if you're actually applying like safety design principles. And so you would basically be able to do a kind of risk assessment. And then the tool could be like, yeah, you know what, you're not safe enough. You need to work on this. So it was a way to educate. And I think those kind of things can certainly happen in India as well. So it's not just about like the law, because I feel like, of course, it's very easy to say keep passing laws, but how do you actually make sure that like what's in the law principally is understood down the line everywhere? And then how are people able to actually think, safety as innovation, safety as a way to beat the competitor, safety is the selling point, right? Everyone always says if you tie in an economic incentive, it'll just happen very quickly. So can you make people understand that if it's a safer experience, more people might want to hang out there on your platform, and this is how you get safer. So I think outside of laws, there's a lot of very interesting work that can be done in the space with developers, with civil society, to understand what does a safe space look like. And I'll say one other thing. I read about this WhatsApp group that takes place, all these children in slums, especially those from the Dalit Bahujan communities. And so how they create a safe space on WhatsApp is that A, everybody has to know each other online. B, you got to be invited to the group, so it's not a public link. C, no screenshots. So what stays in the group stays here. And then they are able to, discuss their experiences. So by that example, what I mean to say is a safe space can mean different things to different people. And you may have 3 or 4 rules that make it a safe space for your particular users. So how do we do a little more thought around that and say there are different versions of safe space based on if you're a public platform, private platform, small group, large group, and then make that accessible to everybody to be able to understand that, oh, I thought I was building a safe space, but I'm not actually doing it. Let me try and do this at the beginning so that I'm not held up in public by the government or by a journalist later. And I think that can help move the needle over here.
Thanks for that, Mahima. I think that's a very useful differentiation. Just as a last question, I think we've talked a lot about what social media, public platforms, private platforms should be thinking of doing in terms of trust and safety, content moderation. We've talked about what governments and regulators should and should not be doing globally to ensure a safer space online. But very quickly, in 30 seconds, as a closing for our listeners, what would your advice be to users on these platforms?
I would say in some cases, what would my advice be to users? I would tell users to just make like more thoughtful decisions about where they want to spend their time. And I think they also need to understand that they themselves behave differently on different platforms, and so will everybody else. I think there's a social aspect to using platforms that we need to just accept. And we will be the better for facing the platforms in the reality that they actually present to us rather than the ideal state, because I think the ideal state when you have so many humans interacting is a difficult thing to achieve. So users should arm themselves with information and frankly curate your experience so you can have a good time. There's a lot of good to be had on social media.
Thanks so much for joining us, Mahima. Sachin and I have had such a wonderful time speaking with you, and there's so many interesting ideas to take away from this conversation and build upon. And we hope our listeners have enjoyed and learned and are able to reflect on many of the themes that have come up in today's conversation. So, thanks once
Thank
again,
you.
Mahima.
Thank you.
We would love to hear your thoughts on the episode and your suggestions on what topics you would like us to cover. You can reach out to us through email or find us on our social media. We will link the details of these in the show notes. Lastly, we would like to thank National Law University Delhi for their support in creating the podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. We look forward to bringing you more content. This podcast is created by Center for Communication Governance at National Law University Delhi. This episode was edited by Gopika.